oldest original medieval king's will, a book which Henry VIII thought had been destroyed, and doodles made by monks 1,000 years ago, all feature in part one of Treasures of a 1,000-year-old archive, where I, Philippa Lacey Brewell, take you to the library and archives at Worcester Cathedral. David Morrison, the cathedral's librarian, kindly showed me around and talked to me about some of the cathedral's incredible treasures. What's the King John Relics Rescue Box?
Fire brigade instructions. We had a practice in November, and they realised in a real fire, like at Notre Dame, you're smashing the glass, and you've got soot on your gloves if you're a fireman, and you're going to ruin everything. So they said, get it all in the sheet, wrap it all up, stick it in the box, get it out the ASAP. So that's their plan.
It's an evacuation box.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, shall we start with King John then?
Okay, yeah, certainly, yeah.
So what do we have?
In 1797, the tomb was actually studied by an archaeologist, and he asked permission to look at the body and do an archaeological study, but he got workmen to help him do the heavy lifting on the day, and they decided on their own initiative to get some souvenirs of their day's hard labour. And so they took a bit of his clothing and a bit of the shroud with the English lion on in gold and a tip of one shoe and even his thumb bone. And their descendants in the 1950s and 60s generally gave them back to the cathedral. But probably more important is the will, which is the earliest medieval royal will left in the UK as an original. So that was presumably brought with King John's body and was stored by the monks in the cathedral archives ever since. And you can see the bottom fold with the slits in, where the seals of the witnesses would have been fixed, or could have been fixed.
It's much smaller than I expected.
Yeah, you didn't have to go into great detail. His key point is to make sure that his sons inherit the throne, and that the witnesses, who are all his loyal supporters, make sure that this happens. So all the other stuff doesn't really matter. And they also pointed out he's actually dictating it, because instead of saying, ask you to do this, it's I, John. So he's obviously on his deathbed, and his scribe is writing down what he's telling him.
I suppose brevity on your deathbed is
Kind
of necessary.
Idea, yeah.
And it's in this that he... Oh, I see there. I desire that my body be buried in the Church of St Mary and St Wolfstan at Worcester. Because he had... Was it St Wolfstan and also he's sort of a big fan of those.
He was, yes. He sort of thought he was... he sort of misunderstood St Wolfstan and thought he was someone who was a good example of a bishop following what a king wanted him to do. So because of that, he often visited Worcester and, while he was alive, and prayed in front of Wolfstan Shrine and that kind of thing.
Ah, so they'd been here a few times. Mind you, in the local area, I've come today from Kidderminster, and the next village along Wolverley. I don't know where this would have been, and I've just heard of it, but that King John had a hunting lodge there, and he would
I think around here, that's right. His favourite hunting grounds were in this area around Feckenham, and so yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, now here is something that I have heard a lot about: the skin of the Dane.
Yes, the Victorians found it on the old west door, and part of that original door is still in the crypt somewhere. And the story that got associated with it was that the Vikings attacked Worcester, and one of them was caught stealing the Sanctus bell, and he was flayed alive as a punishment, and his skin was stuck to the west door as a warning to other Vikings not to attack Worcester. And everyone thought, oh, this is just a very good story, but it's not really true. And then in the 1980s, the University of Birmingham was given samples of the skin, and they tested it in their science laboratories, and they said, yes, it does date to the right time, and it is human, but obviously there's no way to tell whether it was particularly a Viking or not.
Wow.
There could be something in it.
And the west door, presumably that's the one that faces the river?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so
yeah,
it's
a big, major entrance in those days.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm glad I've seen that. Glad. It's a bit weird, but yeah. I've heard the legend many times.
And you've got St Wulfstan's seal here, which is quite rare because you don't normally find Anglo-Saxon seals surviving. So this particular one dates to about 1084, and you can see the saint is sitting on his bishop's throne, and under his hand, he's actually sitting on a dog's head throne, and the armrest of the throne is a carved dog's head. You can see.
Oh yes. Do you know, I wouldn't have picked it out as that unless you'd said so. I don't know what I would have thought it was.
On this table, we've got some of the Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, and the monastery was founded in the 950s or 960s. You can see this is the Winchester Sacramentary. It dates to about 1010, and a scholar was looking at this a few years ago, and she
It's got
realised,
music.
yeah, that's all Anglo-Saxon music notation when it came to Worcester, which the monks added to sing the blessings in the book to the congregation.
How incredible is that?
But she was telling us it's a bit too early in history for her to turn it into modern music.
Right. Yet, I'm sure.
Yet,
I'm
yes,
sure
yeah,
somebody
somebody
wonderful is
will.
working on it.
Yeah.
So presumably they would say bits and then sing these bits
others.
that are slightly, so
Yeah.
they're slightly smaller in the text. The text for anyone listening as opposed to watching is slightly smaller than the other bits, and with notation across the top. I wonder what the red is. I wonder whether that's so this looks like Alleluia. So maybe that's
right. Yeah.
supposed to be a communal bit, like we say Amen.
Yes. Often it's also in service instructions in a service. And then this is a fragment of a 10th century school book for junior monks to learn Latin.
Oh,
And
wow.
you can see it's unfortunately the Tudor monks or the late medieval monks ripped up and used it for bookbinding. And so there's only a few pages left, but it's just a hint there must have been learning here and education way back. There's a cathedral here from 680, but then the monks don't arrive till about the 950s, so there's quite a big gap before they arrive.
But I suppose then it's an established place. That then sort of lends itself to being a school, for want of a better word.
This is quite interesting. So you've got, just as a comparison, this is a 10th century book made probably in the Low Countries or France. And you can see the very tiny handwriting that they had on the continent in the 10th century. In comparison, in the British Isles and this sort of region of Europe, they had much larger handwriting. So it's relatively easy to read. And this one is a church history, but this one is sermons, and made in Worcester. And the cover was repaired in 1939. They kept the basics of the original design, and you can see the original Anglo-Saxon cover was painted red when it was first made. So this is a bit of 10th century artwork, and it's a gospel table. It's the parts of the Gospels which match up according to the Anglo-Saxon numbering system of the Bible. And again, the late medieval monks ripped it up and used it for bookbinding, so that's why there's only one page left. So you have to imagine the other bit of the artwork coming out here. So you've got, obviously, Matthew and Luke there, and there would have been Mark and John. And the silver paint on the columns has tarnished grey over time.
So it would have been silver and gold.
Silver
And the gold
and gold, so it really
stayed.
would have even stood out even more. Now, in the Norman times, you see a lovely bit of decoration there. Two dragons fighting each other in the letter at the beginning. Really lovely detail.
So precise.
Yeah. Really good care with their work.
And this was produced where? Do we
This
know?
was done in the early 12th century, so we're looking at the 1100s.
And here at Worcester.
Yes. And then this is the first bit of singable music in the cathedral from about 1125 to 1150. So apparently, if you're a musician, you could actually transcribe it and sing it for the public.
Yeah, I can see.
I'm not musical, but
Oh, okay. Well, I suppose you could
Apparently
kind
you
of start to obviously
work
the
lines
height
have
of
been
the.
scored in, haven't they? You can
Oh
see.
yes, I see that. So you've got your stave there, so you can see the relative tones for the notes, and then presumably the dots and the length
Indicator.
would indicate maybe the length. So I mean, I don't know, but you could maybe have staccato notes where these dots are, and maybe with the the tails are slightly longer. Wow. I mean, I presume, notation, because I read music, notation, I learnt it as a child, and I look at it now as an adult and think, thank goodness I'm not trying to learn that now, because
as
it
adults,
means nothing to look at, but it's obviously developed over time.
And then that's a book of Psalms made in the year 1200, so around about King John's time. And you can see King David in the letter B with a harp and a dulcimer. And so you've got the way it was done was the scribe would talk to the artist. They would plan out how much space they wanted for the artwork. They'd do the writing first of all, and then you'd put on gesso, which is rather like plaster of Paris, in the shape of the illuminated letter. Then you layer on the gold leaf, and then you burnish it up so it's really shining. And then the last stage is to do the paint.
Right. These materials are incredibly expensive.
Yes, that's true.
You make a mistake and especially if the writing's already
if you've done it, yes, yeah. I think if you've noticed a mistake in the writing, the scribe would have a knife so he could scratch it out quite quickly and write over it. But as you say, the artwork is much harder to correct. And this is a grammar school book from the early 1200s, and there's lovely little cartoons that the monks have added in around comments or corrections in their grammar textbook. And you can see there's all sorts of little cartoons, including there's fishes and Knights Hospitallers, Knights Templars, griffins, horses, boars, dragons, birds, elephants. So there's the Knights Templar or Hospitaller with the comet in his shield.
And that would be what, an addition or a...
Yeah, something that's happened later. There's the one at the bottom is the medieval elephant with his little... He's obviously been told about elephants, but he's never seen a real one because it's got little pig's trotters for feet.
Yeah, he obviously doesn't believe the nose could be quite as long as an elephant's nose. This has got a lot of annotation, correction, don't know.
Yes, this one obviously being used by the monk students when they were at university, so they deliberately left you these big margins in their textbooks to add in your notes. It wasn't considered a bad thing. Not all the books in the monastic libraries were necessarily produced by the monks. Some were donated by people who worked for them. So it could be lawyers or doctors, and then when they retired, they would often give their books to the monastic collection. So this one is an Italian lawyer called Vicarius, and he wrote a textbook for the Oxford law students called, which is where it gets its name from, the Book of the Poor. And there's only 2 other original copies surviving in the world of this one. One's in Bruges and the other's in Prague, and this is the 3rd one. And it's a very good example of Norman handwriting, but also it's quite unusual because you wouldn't normally expect to see artwork in a university textbook. And after this page, the artwork's been prepared, but it hasn't been completed. So they're thinking perhaps it was a gift for a king or a bishop. The person died and they just left it in them.
It didn't get completed.
Yeah, it didn't get given.
Is it unusual as well for the artwork to be, this is kind of 2/3 down the page? Or is that just be the start of the next chapter or something like that?
Yeah, it's probably just the start of the next section.
And that's incredible. The blue is really
it's lovely,
vivid.
Isn't it? Mm. And again, another lovely little cartoon characters you can see in this.
Goodness me, when does this date back?
So this dates to the 14th century. Again, it's a manual of canon law, so sort of church law, and lovely decoration from that sort of century. All little funny faces all around the edges of the first page. And then we've got 2 medical books, just as an example of things from the time of the Crusades, and these were done in the Mediterranean region, and then must have been brought back to Worcester afterwards. And you can see the first is a little Italian-style medical book So somewhere made perhaps at the medical school at Salerno, somewhere like that. And it dates to the 12th century. And you can see all the doctor's notes in the tiny, tiny handwriting
Yes.
all the way through his textbook. And whichever person brought this back from the Crusades, he's obviously thought of his lady friend
Look at
on his
that.
travelling back on the boat, perhaps.
How wonderful.
This is its companion, and it starts off with an Arabic to Latin medical dictionary at the beginning,
Oh, how brilliant.
and then an Arabic to Latin apothecaries' weights and measures for making your medicines. So you can...
Useful.
And then a series of Arabic medical textbooks, all translated into Latin for a Western audience.
So they're learning, they're
Sharing knowledge.
sharing. Amazing. Yeah.
And then right at the back, 2 little Italian medical textbooks, again in Latin for a Western European audience.
And these are what bound together once
All
they
bound
get
together.
here?
No,
Or-
they're possibly, but probably bound around about the same time.
Right.
And you can see the tiny pinholes down the edge of the page, which is one of the tricks the scribes often use to give you the line spacing. So you get a little wheel with pins in or a compass, and depending on this gap, that gives you your
Clever.
the
So they would
things.
just
It's all
roll
regular.
it down.
Yeah. And then probably the cathedral's most important book is the Worcester Antiphona. It's got all the music and all the services for your particular monastery for every day of the year. And at the Reformation, these were hunted down and burned. And a lot of the music for Worcester was actually burnt on the green just out there. And this was hidden somewhere in the county and not given back to the cathedral until after the burnings had stopped. So it's really useful for music students and music scholars.
So how many of these exist?
I think
at
there's just
all?
one other Benedictine one surviving in Cambridge, and this is the other one from medieval England. So
Oh, wow.
it's really useful. It took 5 years for the monks to make it, and they finished it in the year 1230.
It really was supposed to be a complete erasure of what
Nobody
came
could go back to
before.
Catholicism, yeah.
Yeah. Can't go back because we're losing all the record,
All these
everything.
things. And from Christmas time, you can see the Advent antiphons, which are here. So in Worcester, they know from other documents in the collection that the senior monks would each sing one of these Advent antiphons, and then they'd give out pocket money to the junior monks to buy winter hats and boots and clothing. And then once the monks start going to university, the range of manuscripts that they collect really expands quite rapidly. And there's some incredible artwork in some of them, and still really sharp. I mean, this is from the 1200s, and the ink still looks really, really good.
It really does. Do you know what the pigments were made from? The reds and the
Yeah,
blues,
so
particularly?
the ink, the key ingredients in the black ink are iron sulphate and oak apple gall. In the red and the blue, in this particular case, it's probably animal dye. And then if it was artwork, you're looking at sort of crushed minerals, so say azurite for blue, or saffron for yellow, or something like that.
I love how these books are clearly working books with all the additions and
Yeah.
notes and annotations.
But
And this would have been used over how many? Well, these,
yeah,
how
well,
many
so
years?
when they get back from university, the next 2 monks who are going down there, they'd give them their books to take with them down to the... So as you say, probably all sorts of monks got to use the same textbook. But sometimes you didn't have a particular book in your monastery and you needed it for your course. And so you might have to get a professional scribe to make it up for you when you were down in Oxford, or you might be allowed to borrow pages and copy it out yourself part at a time. So this is a history book from the 14th century, and it's Josephus' History of the Jews and the Jewish War against the Romans.
Obviously, it would be fascinating to see how they wrote the history of the Jews and the Romans.
Yeah. Well, Josephus was, he's one of the few books outside of the Bible who mentions seeing Jesus and John the Baptist and other people. So for them, it was a useful source of information. And if you look carefully in the letter P there, the artist who they've hired to make this manuscript for them has had a little joke at the monk's student's expense, with the monk's mouth and the grapes and the vine leaves shooting out of it. And then this is a lawyer's handbook actually used in the courtroom in 14th century Herefordshire. And just like we have sticky notes today, he's got his little calfskin tags down the side of the law book.
Oh, that's fantastic. Quick reference. I mean, it's a big book, so to be fair to him, he's allowed. He's got a lot to remember.
And then first law in the book is Magna Carta, which is there.
Wow. Of course, of King John fame. So which Magna Carta is this taken from?
One from the 1220s. He's obviously got very bored in the courtroom one day listening to one of the cases because he's been drawing sausage dogs and cartoon characters in his own law book.
I love the idea. Humans are humans, and we could get as bored as any generation.
Yeah.
Funny.
And then this is a little West Midlands bravery, and you can see the typical English 15th century decoration.
And the gold again, still.
Very shiny. And almost like peacock's feathers, isn't it, the design?
Oh, yes.
Then they still find fragments down the bindings of books, all sorts of different things, which are medieval. And this one's an early maths textbook. And you can see when it was a complete book, the monks had to go in the margin of drawing some of the instructions, drawing out the triangles.
I mean, anyone who's endured GCSE maths will sympathise, yeah. All these little fragments. So I suppose then they weren't seen as particularly important at the time, that they're then
later after the Reformation, they were probably just used
maybe
as binding.
actively.
Maybe
Destroyed.
And this is a lovely one. This is a little textbook, but what's different about it is this particular monk has got to revise for his exams, and so they didn't have page numbers in those days. So what he's done is he's drawn little cartoons next to bits of the text that he needs to remember. And each cartoon is different and is usually looking at or pointing at something. And you can also see all his lecture notes in the margins as he's at Oxford.
Would they all go to Oxford then?
The monks generally on the western side of England did, and those on the eastern side went to Cambridge.
Ah. Oh, east-west divide.
Yeah.
Straight away. I love the idea of how much time it probably took to do that. These little drawings, one of
they're really quite detailed.
Pointing finger. One of what's that supposed to be? A bird with a baby's head and hooves, with a arrow tongue coming out of its mouth, pointing. You wonder whether that's the bit you didn't like, or something. It's finding hard to remember.
I mean, there's all sorts of little cartoons. You get sort of devils and monsters and monkeys and giraffe men and two tiny hands with a little rope because it's two ideas connected.
Oh, that's clever. Very good aid memoirs, actually, having a different cartoon character for each element. I wonder if that helped him remember.
And they get sort of more beasts, and then you get sort of pilgrims' heads on animal bodies and senior clergy with animal bodies and all sorts.
Now, is this making fun, or is this...
I think that you often see that in medieval cartoons and artwork, where they've sort of conventions are turned upside down, and you get sort of animals hunting humans, or fun being made of important figures in society. And we even think he might have been a traveller to Sicily, because apparently the top half of the picture is the Sicilian badge with the crescent underneath the three legs, even though it looks like the Isle of Man.
Yes, it also
symbol.
does, yes.
And then in the later Middle Ages you get really spectacular books. So this is the Hereford Missal, made for one of the big churches in Herefordshire. And every major bit of the church here has got a lovely bit of illumination and artwork.
This is, I think, more typically what you think of when you think of all the monastic books.
Yes.
With this...
Sort of very heavy.
very heavy, very gold, very... all full of nature, animals, leaves. Absolutely beautiful. And this is 15th century.
Yeah.
And are the illuminated pages, for what particular purpose? Or it's just there's so many pages through, so they do an illuminated one, or is it the start
It's
of a
usually the
chapter?
start of something important.
Okay.
Or a chapter, yes. And again, this one's got some music in as well. And just a little bit, but
There's something even more fascinating about the music, because the idea you can hear the same things that they would hear.
and this is a Wycliffe New Testament. 37 pages of artwork all the way through the manuscript. And when this was first commissioned, it was hidden in somebody's house because you weren't allowed to have this particular translation of the Bible. And you could have been burned at the stake.
Is this in English?
Yeah, so that's Middle English.
Yeah. You can pick out some words and then others are getting more difficult. Yeah. Look at the pink.
Yeah. So they probably used lead oxide to give you the white and to help do the sort of shading and lighten the reds.
Because it has shading, which you don't
always see.
in,
No.
Because the sort of muted tones more than, the previous ones you've got red and blue.
Yeah.
And here they've gone...
It's much more subtle.
Mm.
So this wasn't given to the cathedral till after the Reformation, but it's a really beautiful book. And they still use it today when they install bishops and deans in the cathedral. This is the book they swear on. And each cathedral should have a special book for those kind of occasions.
And this is the one.
And then the French and the Italians specialised in microscopic books in the later Middle Ages.
Now,
And this is a little Italian miniature Bible from the later 15th century. And each letter is actually about 2 millimetres high. So it's incredibly small. And we asked a calligrapher, how could they have done this? And she said, well, if she was trying to do it today, she'd probably get her ordinary goose quill, but then she'd get like a robin's feather or a sparrow's feather or some other small bird and use that as the nib.
Right, so you just make the nib a lot smaller, but
Much
the
smaller.
eyesight you must require.
Absolutely, incredible. And then this is a little Italian communicant prayers for the Mass for the priest, about 1400 again.
Oh, and this has full
Pictures.
full illustrations. More, they're not fanciful. I suppose there's more. They look like they're actually representing a scene.
Yeah. And you're starting to get perspective coming in the buildings in the background.
So what's this used for?
So that'll be in the services during the Mass. And then someone would hold that up for the priest. So you've got the nice big handwriting so that if it's held slightly to one side, he
can still see
it. He can turn around and quickly look at it and read off it.
The purpose of the illustrations, do you think there's something around standardised practices or just for decoration?
I suppose those ones are relevant to that bit of the book, so that makes sense why they've put those in there.
Because you've got a congregation all on their knees, no one sitting. You've got a definite order of people attending. And you've got them...
holding up the bread and the wine in two different
to Christ
situations.
And then the Virgin Mary in the other one. Oh, I see. So you've got the bread they're holding up to Christ on the cross and the wine in front of the Virgin Mary.
And then ordinary people towards the end of the Middle Ages wanted to start owning their own prayer books, and these were called Books of Hours, and they were specially commissioned. And they contained all sorts of different things, including the main services of the day, rather like the monastic hours. But this one's a deluxe sort of copy made in the southeast of England, around about 1380, for a family. And there's 18 of these heavily illuminated pages all the way through this particular book. So this is the kind of thing you'd want your neighbours to see that you owned.
Yeah. Because this is a fairly large... You can tell that this is a book, so this is sort of meant to be on the side, or supposedly,
Yes,
and visible.
And it might have saints' days or saints that were special to your family and calendars at the beginning. And things like that to make it personal. And you would go along to a stationer's and commission this, so that he would have a team of artists and scribes working for him, unlike the monks. And depending on how much money you put into it, obviously the team would produce a really quite nice book. Probably more typical of a book of hours is something like this, a little English or maybe French, about 1400. And you can see different sections of the book have relevant bits of artwork. So if you were in a hurry, you could find the right picture and you know you're in the right section.
Do any of these have any scrubbed out saint stories, like Beckett's or?
I think some names have been taken out of one of the antiphona, but I don't know about this one.
I suppose they were, if the book was hidden potentially. I suppose
That's right. You wouldn't need to. No.
Scrub it out.
And then the Dutch, you can see, have a very different style to the English and the French, much more like a lace pattern around the edges. And the Dutch artists took a lot of care with their books of hours, so they always try and vary the pattern. It's not just the same old design used throughout the book. And each of the major sections have a bit of artwork as well in the margin. So again, that's a really lovely.
It's much more floral, isn't it? And lots of gold, but in tiny bits, so the entire page sparkles. Thank you for joining me for part 1 of Treasures of a 1,000-year-old archive. Here is a quick sneak preview as to what is in part 2.
And then in this Elizabethan notebook from 1584, somebody found there's a complete copy of Henry VIII's will, and they did a quick summary for us. So presumably one of the canons from Worcester Cathedral went down in Queen Elizabeth's reign to Windsor and copied out the will for some reason into their notebook and then brought it back to the cathedral.
But I bet this is quite revolutionary in terms of a book with a fold-out page.
To think of that, it's a year after the Battle of Bosworth, and here's somebody thinking, I'm going to design a travel book, and it was a really successful seller because it was such a good idea.
Yeah.